You wake up in a medieval village. Correction, you are already awake because it's 1348, and the concept of sleeping 8 hours straight like a normal modern human with blackout curtains, memory foam pillows, and melatonin gummies hasn't been invented yet. Instead, you've been first sleeping since sunset, and now you're lying on your itchy straw mattress, conveniently stuffed with hay, mice, and probably some legacy fleas from the last person who died in it, waiting for second sleep. Welcome to your night. There's no alarm clock, no phone, no electric lights. Just your neighbor snoring like a cursed warthog through the thin wall of wattle and daub. Outside, the wind howls like a tortured soul. Inside, your chamber pot is approximately 6 inches from your head, and if you're lucky, no one has kicked it over yet. You're lying in the same clothes you wore to work in the fields, because owning separate pajamas is for literal royalty. The scent? A complex mix of sweat, candle wax, sheep, and spiritual dread. You sit up groggily. Not because you're refreshed, but because this is the medieval version of doom scrolling. The hours between first and second sleep are sacred. People use this time to check on animals, gossip with family, steal bread, or, as you're about to do, pray. Not because you're particularly pious, but because everything outside your tiny hovel is terrifying, and God is basically your only insurance policy. So before you curl back into your itchy blanket and contemplate the sound of rats wrestling in the rafters, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Seriously, I'm not a monk, I won't guilt you into it. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I always find it oddly delightful to see who's joining the sleepy historical spiral from across the planet. Now, where were we? Yes. The grim priest news ritual of whispering desperate words to a sky that's both physically and metaphorically dark. Bedtime prayers. A tradition born from a beautiful combination of fear, fatigue, and the deep human desire to not wake up in hell. The first thing to understand is that medieval bedtime prayers weren't optional. You didn't casually skip them like a Pilates class. No, praying before sleep was as necessary as not dying of plague or making sure the roof hadn't collapsed on your baby in the night. Your soul depended on it. Also, it gave you something to do between terrifying dreams about demons and hearing wolves in the distance. If you were lucky, you had access to an actual prayer, maybe you could even read it, which would make you part of the 5% literacy club. Congratulations. If not, you just repeated what you'd been told by someone slightly more literate, like a priest or that one weird cousin who went on pilgrimage and came back with a sandal made of bones. The classics were simple. Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit, or now I lay me down to sleep, I pray the Lord my soul to keep, which is about as comforting as a haunted lullaby. Imagine saying that every night while curled up on a sack of bugs with your only source of warmth being your own guilt. It's like tucking yourself in with a hug made of existential dread. Why was this necessary? Because medieval people believed that demons were especially active at night. Not just metaphorical demons like stress and regret, actual, literal devils who wandered around trying to steal your soul while you drooled into your cowhide pillow. This wasn't superstition. This was science, circa 1200 AD. You weren't just protecting your soul. You were arming it. With words. Because if Satan popped in during your REM cycle, a well-recited psalm might be your only line of defense. You didn't have holy water or a crucifix under your pillow unless you were very rich or accidentally living in a church. Most people had words. And maybe a splinter of a saint's femur if you were lucky. The prayers themselves were weird. Let's just say, not every Our Father was sweet and soothing. Some were filled with vivid imagery of death, hellfire, rotting bodies, and God's overwhelming disappointment in your existence. Others were focused on the saints, who were kind of like spiritual customer service representatives, except they all died horribly and usually carried the tools of their own execution in stained glass portraits. Saint Lawrence, grilled alive. Saint Catherine, torn apart on a spiked wheel. Saint Lucy, carried her eyeballs around on a plate. These were your nighttime comfort characters. You whispered to them in the dark, hoping they'd intercede for you. Like a celestial Yelp review, Dear St. Peter, 5 stars. Please let me into heaven. P.S. Sorry for the goat incident. And let's talk about why you were so terrified. Because let's be honest, going to sleep in the Middle Ages was genuinely risky. You could die in your sleep from 100 things: a burst appendix, a rat bite, a fire started by a drunken neighbor, or just plain old God's mysterious plan, which was the medieval equivalent of oops, not sure, guess it's your time. This is why bedtime prayers were less about relaxing and more about bargaining. You weren't asking for good dreams. You were asking not to die in a state of mortal sin. You were pleading, nightly, not to wake up in a place where everyone's shoes are on fire and your sins are read aloud by a choir of sarcastic angels. The bedtime ritual was often part of a longer process called compline. That's the final canonical hour of the day, used by monks, nuns, and the occasional overachieving peasant. Think of it as the spiritual version of shutting down your 14th century operating system. Except instead of clicking sleep mode, you chant psalms in Latin and stare into the darkness wondering if you remember to confess that thing you did with the cheese knife. Monastic communities were particularly intense about this. If you lived in a monastery, your whole day was carved up into chunks of sacred obligation. Compline prayers were said just before total silence. And by silence, we mean absolute, monastic silence. You weren't allowed to talk, hum, cough too enthusiastically, or exhale judgmentally at the brother who forgot his line. And the prayers? Often sung. In Gregorian chant. Slowly. In Latin. With enough minor keys to make your entire soul feel like it was sinking into a vat of holy molasses. It's basically ASMR for people afraid of eternal damnation. The standard compline might include Psalm 4, Psalm 91, and the Nunc Dimittis, a prayer said by Simeon who was basically the I can finally die now guy in the Bible. Comforting. Psalm 91 was a fan favorite. You might recognize it from that time. It was quoted by Satan in the Bible while tempting Jesus. You know, the passage about God protecting you from pestilence and letting you tread on the lion and the cobra. Because that feels relevant when your main concern is not rolling into your own chamber pot in the night. Now, you might be thinking, surely the rich had it better. And yes, technically. If you were a noble, your mattress probably had feathers instead of straw. Your prayers were written in books illuminated with enough gold leaf to bankrupt a small town. You might even have a chaplain to read the prayers for you while you lay there digesting a leg of something endangered. But you still had to pray. Because if you were rich, you had more to worry about. Like whether the Pope liked your family this week. Or if your soul would end up in purgatory for the next 300 years unless your descendants coughed up enough coin to fund a cathedral or 3. And just to be clear, purgatory was not fun. According to contemporary descriptions, it was like being slowly braised in divine regret. And there was no guarantee you'd get out. Unless, of course, your relatives remembered to pay for prayers on your behalf. Which is tricky, considering that most medieval nobles had about 17 children and only liked maybe 3 of them. Let's not forget that bedtime prayers were gendered too. If you were a woman, especially a mother, your nighttime prayers included special requests like please don't let the baby die in its sleep, please don't let me die in childbirth tomorrow, and please make my husband's foot fungus go away. Many medieval prayer books for women included deeply emotional pleas for strength, endurance, and forgiveness, mostly because their lives were a non-stop horror film with bonus embroidery. And kids? Oh, bedtime prayers were drilled into them early. Usually right after they were old enough to walk, speak, or survive their first 5 winters. Parents would teach them the simple ones first. Rhyming prayers. Scary ones. If I die before I wake wasn't just a nursery rhyme. It was a very real possibility. Eventually, the prayers became habit. Muscle memory. A nightly chant muttered into the itchy darkness, between prayers for survival and whispers about sins you didn't even know counted. Like thinking about bread too lustfully, or coveting your neighbor's goat. The result? A whole population of sleep-deprived peasants, whispering sacred words into the void, hoping the next breath wouldn't be their last. It was kind of beautiful. And kind of terrible. And definitely not what you'd call relaxing. So as you settle in, whether you're in a fluffy 21st century bed or wrapped in a fleece burrito of modern convenience, just remember that your ancestors didn't fall asleep to Netflix. They fell asleep to fear, psalms, and the sound of wind scraping at wooden shutters while wolves paced in the forest. We'll explore more weird, wonderful, and occasionally terrifying aspects of medieval bedtime in the next chapter. Don't worry. We're just getting started. You lie back down. Your spine sinks into something sharp in the mattress. You tell yourself it's a stick. It's probably not a stick. But you don't have time for that thought spiral, because now it's time to contemplate something even more relaxing than physical discomfort, the terrifying concept of nocturnal demonic visitation. You see, back in the Middle Ages, sleep wasn't just sleep. It was a battlefield for your immortal soul. And your enemy? Not just hunger, back pain, or the vague sensation of having rolled into a puddle of someone else's sweat. No, your greatest enemy in the hours after Compline was a demon named Incubus. Yes, like the band, but with less eyeliner and more non-consensual soul-sucking. The incubus and its female counterpart, the succubus, was believed to sit on your chest while you slept. Not in a fun, dreamlike way. No, in a you wake up paralyzed, drenched in sweat, unable to breathe, and convinced you're being crushed by invisible sin kind of way. Today, we call this sleep paralysis. Back then, they called it Thursday. People believed demons could sneak into your room at night, especially if you forgot your bedtime prayers. That's right, miss one Our Father and next thing you know, your spiritual door is left ajar like a cursed medieval 7-Eleven, welcoming every passing evil entity to stop in for a quick haunting. To protect yourself, you'd say a few extra words. Maybe deliver us from evil with extra intensity. Maybe toss in a Hail Mary or 3, just to be safe. Maybe, if you were especially afraid, you'd sleep with a piece of iron under the bed. Why? Because demons obviously hate metallurgy. That tracks. You also might sleep with your feet pointing east, toward Jerusalem, and your head away from the door. That way, your soul wouldn't accidentally fly out of your body and head in the wrong direction, like some spiritually confused moth. If you were rich, you might own a tiny book of hours, a devotional book filled with bedtime prayers and terrifying artwork. These were luxury items. Like an iPhone, if your iPhone had images of beheadings and 7-headed dragons gnawing on monks. Very soothing. Now, let's pivot, because who doesn't love a sharp, sleepy turn, into saints? Saints were your bedtime support network, your spiritual Wi-Fi. If the prayers weren't enough, you could call on one of your favorites. There were hundreds, and they each had a specialty. Like Pokemon, but with more martyrdom. Say you were afraid of dying in your sleep, understandable. You might pray to Saint Joseph, patron of a peaceful death. That's right, this guy was considered lucky because he died in his sleep surrounded by Jesus and Mary. The medieval gold standard for an exit. Or maybe you had night terrors. Enter Saint Michael the Archangel. Big sword. Huge wings. Basically heaven's bouncer. You'd call on him to stand at your bedside and keep out the darkness, spiritual or otherwise. Some people even drew little doodles of him and tucked them under the pillow. Ancient protection spell? Sure. Early fan art? Definitely. There were saints for fevers, saints for back pain, saints for teeth grinding, broken dreams, livestock, and not dying of shame. If you had a problem, there was probably a saint who had already died in a worse way and was now eternally employed in divine customer service. Let's pause for a moment to consider the smells in your room. Because medieval bedtime wasn't just emotionally terrifying, it was olfactorily aggressive. Your chamber pot, if you were lucky enough to have one, was likely unemptied. The fire, if still burning, gave off the aroma of smoky peat mixed with desperation. Your clothes? Unwashed. The sheets? Non-existent. Your mattress? A glorious cocktail of straw, wool, and slowly decomposing despair. Still awake? Good. Let's talk about nightmares. The medieval mind took nightmares very seriously. They weren't just dreams about failing an exam naked or showing up late to the market. They were warnings, divine signals, or even direct attacks from hell. Dreams were categorized. You had true dreams, sent by God. These were cryptic and usually involved someone standing on a mountain shouting things like, "Repent, for the stars weep blood." Then you had false dreams, sent by the devil, which featured either terrifying beasts or sensual distractions. Spoiler, if you enjoyed the dream too much, it was definitely from the devil. To analyze these dreams, some people kept dream journals. Others went to their local priest and described the dream in detail, hoping for interpretation and maybe a light exorcism if things had gotten out of hand. If you dreamed of flying, pride. If you dreamed of falling, humility. If you dreamed of food, gluttony. If you dreamed of someone you weren't married to, Let's just say confession was recommended immediately. But what caused these dreams, besides spiritual warfare? Well, medieval people believed that what you ate before bed directly influenced your dreams. Eating too much cheese? Demon dreams. Too much wine? Lusty visions. Beans? Oh, definitely beans were demonic. The gas alone could summon poltergeists. In fact, there were entire dream books that connected every image in your dreams to a moral flaw or future event. Dreamed of a pig? Someone close to you is plotting betrayal. Dreamed of a snake? Obvious. Evil. Dreamed of a donkey wearing a bishop's hat? Probably time to stop drinking mead before bed. Let's not forget the bells. Yes, bells. In many towns, a church bell was rung at nightfall, a call to evening prayer and a reminder that your soul was now on borrowed time. This bell, called the curfew bell, came from the old French couvre-feu, meaning cover the fire. Because once that bell rang, it was time to put out your hearth, pray for mercy, and tuck yourself into whatever semblance of bedding you had. But the bell had another meaning, a spiritual one. It was a signal that the veil between worlds was thinning. The night belonged to the dead, the demons, and everything in between. The ringing of the bell was both a warning and a shield. It said, "Hey, darkness, we know you're out there. Don't even try it." And then there were the bedtime rituals that straddled the line between piety and superstition. You might trace a cross on your chest 3 times before closing your eyes, or spit over your shoulder to ward off the devil, not just because you were rude. Or sprinkle a bit of salt near the bed. Why salt? Because in the medieval world, salt wasn't just seasoning. It was a holy substance, unchanging, pure, and allegedly very confusing for demons. Some households, especially in the countryside, had their own strange, whispered rites. Prayers that had been passed down generations, half Christian, half pagan. Some involved knotting threads, saying special words while tying and untying pieces of cloth or placing objects at each corner of the bed to bind the spirits. And then, there was the night. Black. Silent. Except for the things that weren't silent. Owls hooting, considered omens. Dogs barking, bad news. Wolves howling, terrible news. Cats hissing, your soul is definitely in danger. And if you heard a knock on the door after the curfew bell, absolutely do not answer it. That's either a thief, a ghost, or worse, a priest with questions. You lay there, listening. Your heartbeat is your lullaby. Your breath, shallow. Your soul, hopefully intact. Outside, the stars are watching. Not twinkling, watching. The moon hangs above like a celestial eyeball, and the wind rattles the shutters like a polite demon trying to get your attention. And inside, you clutch your blanket, which is just 2 sheets of wool stitched together by someone who didn't believe in comfort, and repeat the final words of your prayer. Deliver us, O Lord, from every evil, and grant us a peaceful night and a perfect end. Spoiler, your end will probably involve some kind of medieval illness, but hey, it's the thought that counts. You close your eyes. The floor creaks. Was that a rat? Or something more spiritual? Either way, you're too tired to care. You let sleep take you. Because you've done all you can. You've prayed. You've bargained. You've listed every known saint and half of the minor ones. And now, as you sink back into that itchy, possibly haunted mattress, you wonder, will you wake up in the morning? Or in the presence of a very unimpressed angel? You wake up, but not because of a noise. Not because of a dream, or a nightmare, or a vision of Saint Michael folding his celestial laundry at the foot of your bed. No, this time, you wake up because it's simply time. Time for the most confusing and strangely polite insomnia in history. This is first sleep ending and second sleep not quite beginning. Yes, in the Middle Ages, people didn't just sleep straight through the night like we try to now with white noise machines, blackout curtains, and an ever-growing army of overpriced ergonomic pillows. No, they slept in 2 distinct phases. First sleep began shortly after sunset, after Compline was chanted, after you whispered your increasingly panicked prayers and spat once or twice at invisible demons. You'd conk out for about 4 hours. Then, like clockwork, you'd wake up, usually between midnight and 2 a.m. Why? Because that's just what people did. Sleep science, yes, we're going there, shows that humans naturally sleep in segmented cycles when left to their own devices. You fall asleep, then you wake up in the dead of night, stare at your straw ceiling, and contemplate mortality for about an hour or two before drifting off again. But back then, this midnight waking wasn't a bug. It was a feature. It even had a name, the watch or the waking. Because what else would you call that mysterious, slightly creepy window of time when the entire world is quiet and your brain is free to think of literally everything you've ever done wrong since birth? Now, before you reach for a candle or try to scroll Instagram, which, spoiler, still hasn't been invented, you might be wondering, what did people actually do during this awake time? Good question. Answer, basically everything. Let's start with the godly folks. Monks and nuns were expected to rise at this hour anyway for their nocturnes or matins, depending on how much the abbey hated sleep. This was the time to pray in the dark, sing psalms, and ask God, once again, to forgive you for that impure thought you had about bread last week. Outside the monasteries, ordinary people had their own version of midnight devotions. This was a prime time to sneak in a few extra prayers, especially if you were behind on your soul maintenance schedule. You might recite psalms in Latin, even if you didn't understand Latin, because God knows what you meant. Hopefully. But let's say you were less inclined to worry about eternal damnation and more interested in using your time productively. You could, for instance, have sex. Yes, this was the prime time for conjugal visitation. Several historical texts, bless their nosy little parchment hearts, describe how this period between sleeps was considered a good time for intimacy. Think of it as the original Netflix and chill, except instead of Netflix you had a dying fire and the sound of rats mating in the rafters. There are records of married couples using this time for pillow talk, cuddles, and, depending on your social class, a chance to warm your hands on your partner's body heat before crawling back under the damp wool blanket you both pretended was romantic. If you were alone, well, the church had strict opinions about what not to do. And the fact that they kept mentioning it kinda gives you an idea of how common it was. Hence all the extra prayers. And the saints. And the guilt. Still not sleepy? Good. Because this weird twilight window was also an ideal time for craft work, light chores, or quiet conversation. You might darn a sock by candlelight. Mend a tunic. If you were literate, lucky you might read from a devotional book. Or stare longingly at someone else's. If you had kids, you might check if they were still breathing, gently poke them, maybe even move them to make room for your elbow. In some households, especially in colder months, people gathered around the hearth during this break in sleep. They whispered, told stories, shared news from the village. This was when secrets were told, rumors were passed, and ghost stories were whispered just soft enough to make everyone feel alive and slightly haunted. For the rich, this was sometimes even a time for writing letters or hosting private meetings. Imagine that, being invited to a social visit that starts at 1 a.m. Today that's either a rave or a cry for help. Back then, it was just part of the night. And yes, sometimes people just lay in bed, staring into the dark, going through all their regrets. You know, just like you. This waking time wasn't viewed as insomnia. It was part of the rhythm. As natural as sunrise, or fleas, or being disappointed by your son's decision to become a baker instead of a monk. Sleep was porous, like everything else in medieval life. Life and death, heaven and hell, day and night, all existed in constant blur and flux. No one expected clean lines. Which brings us to the dangers of this in-between time. The night was when boundaries were weakest. Evil slipped between them. If you were awake and not praying, you were seen as suspicious. Witches were set to work at this hour. Midwives, too. Which, you know, says something about misogyny and patriarchy, but let's just file that under ongoing problems. Some people kept protective charms nearby during the waking hour. Things like iron nails, bits of wood from holy trees, or even wax figurines of saints. Yes, wax saints. The original Funko Pop, but with the power to ward off evil rather than collect dust on your shelf. Let's not forget the ultimate fear, wandering spirits. If you were awake and heard footsteps, a whisper, or something move that should not have moved, well, best to stay under your covers and pretend to be asleep. Ghosts, they said, couldn't hurt you if they thought you were already gone. A spiritual version of if I can't see it, it can't see me. Eventually, the fire dies. The room cools. And your mind, which has been racing through psalms, sins, and phantom noises begins to quiet. You enter second sleep. This one is deeper, dreamier, less interrupted. It carries you through to sunrise, unless, of course, you're a servant, in which case you'll be up before the sun even stretches. For peasants, this second sleep might end with the sounds of roosters, heavy boots, or someone shouting about the cows again. For monks, it ended with lauds, the dawn prayer. Cold water, cold air, cold everything, and gratitude. Because, congratulations, you survived the night. Second sleep often brought with it the dreams of angels, or visions, or just a brief mental vacation from everything that smelled like mildew and moral panic. Waking from this second sleep, you were expected to be refreshed, purified, and ready to face your penance for all the sins you committed, real or imagined, between midnight and 3 a.m. You rose, once again, with prayer. And, probably, a lot of yawning. Because segmented sleep is natural. But no one said it wasn't exhausting. As the light creeps in through the cracks in your shuttered window, and the crows begin their ritual screaming outside, you pull your woolen wrap tighter and ask yourself a simple question. Was this really the best we ever did for bedtime? Possibly not. But at least it came with poetry, demons, and a robust saint-based customer support system. And if you're still awake? Perfect. Because next, we're going to talk about the things that shared your bed with you, and spoiler, not just your spouse. You're awake again. Or maybe you never fell asleep. It's hard to tell, really, because you spent the last 3 hours in a sort of low-level, itchy, spiritual crisis. The mattress is poking you. The blanket smells like boiled goat. And there's something crawling on your ankle. Don't panic. It's probably just a flea. Or a lice colony. Or your uncle. Because tonight, like every night in the medieval world, you don't sleep alone. Even if you want to. Even if you've earned it. Even if you said enough bedtime prayers to start a minor monastery. There's always someone or something in the bed with you. Let's start with the basics. You, being a peasant, a monk, a tradesman, a yeoman, or anyone who isn't a monarch or church bishop, are probably sleeping on a shared bed. This means multiple bodies. One mattress. Varying levels of flatulence. Think of it like a family-size pizza, but instead of pepperoni, it's just a lot of shared body heat and passive-aggressive blanket politics. If you're poor, and let's be honest, statistically speaking, your bed is probably in a one-room house. That's it. One room. For sleeping, cooking, eating, praying, occasionally dying, and housing the chicken that won't stop pooping in your boots. There's no privacy. No guest rooms. No en-suites. Just the cold hard reality that medieval people slept in groups like hibernating squirrels trying to survive capitalism. Children, in the bed. Siblings, in the bed. Cousins visiting from the next village over because their house burned down in a pig-related accident, also in the bed. You've got bodies to the left of you, bodies to the right, and one person definitely talking in their sleep in a language that no one remembers learning. Now let's talk about infants. Babies, obviously, don't have cribs. There's no such thing as a baby monitor. If your child is sleeping more than 2 feet from your body, they might as well be in another dimension. So the baby sleeps next to you, or sometimes on you, or in a makeshift basket wedged between your knees and someone's thigh. Co-sleeping was the norm. It was the only norm. And yes, it came with its risks. Infant mortality was sky high. People worried about overlaying, accidentally smothering your child in the night. The church even warned mothers about this in sermons, describing it as both a tragedy and a moral failing, because why not sprinkle a little guilt on top of your trauma? Now, you might be wondering, what about beds for servants or apprentices? Oh, sweet summer child. Servants slept wherever there was floor. That's it. If you had a little status, maybe you got the hearth. If you didn't, you curled up near the animals, and hoped no one stepped on you during their midnight wee. Apprentices in busy urban households, tailors, blacksmiths, coopers, might share a trundle bed beneath the master's bed. This was like being an underbed goblin, emerging at dawn with sleepy hair and a headache from inhaling 13th century foot odor all night. Speaking of apprentices, if you were traveling, you'd share a bed with complete strangers. Yes, inns weren't like today's hotels. You didn't get your own room with keycards and a mint on the pillow. You got a space in a shared bed, with someone whose name you didn't know, whose hygiene you didn't trust, and whose snoring could trigger small earthquakes. In fact, bed sharing with strangers was a totally normal part of hospitality. It was a sign of trust, a way to bond, and also the result of never having invented enough beds. So you'd climb into the mattress, sometimes just a sack stuffed with straw, sometimes a little better, and hope they didn't steal your boots during the night. Or spoon you without warning. Or both. And now, a word about the mattress itself. Calling it a mattress is, frankly, optimistic. You're lying on a tick, which is just a big bag made of linen or hemp, stuffed with something uncomfortably natural, like straw, moss, wool, or, if your family was feeling fancy, feathers. But don't get too excited about feathers. Because these were not your Instagrammable goose-down pillows. These were low-grade, scratchy, molded feathers from birds that died of natural causes and possibly regret. Every few months, the straw had to be changed. And by changed, we mean scooped out, burned in the yard, and replaced before the mattress liquefied from fungal ambition. Beneath the mattress? Wooden slats, maybe. Or ropes. That sagged. And squeaked. And eventually collapsed at 3 a.m. in a way that would be hilarious if your tailbone wasn't already cracked. Over you? A blanket made from wool. Thick, scratchy, poorly dyed, occasionally still containing evidence that it had once belonged to a sheep named Harold. No duvets. No weighted blankets. No fancy throws. Just a heavy sheet of scratch. Now, if you were rich, the experience improved slightly. You'd sleep in a 4-poster bed, possibly with bed curtains to keep out drafts and peasants. These curtains also helped with privacy, which in medieval noble households was about as rare as common sense during a plague year. The bed might even have a canopy to prevent things from falling from the rafters, like dust, insects, or a curious cat named Jeffrey. And yes, pets. Because what's medieval sleep without a dog licking your face or a chicken roosting on your foot? Cats were common, especially for catching mice, eating food scraps, and silently judging you during your prayers. Dogs too. Not just noble lapdogs, though there were plenty of those, but working dogs. Farm dogs. Flea-ridden, snoring beasts who didn't understand personal space but loved to hog the warm spot. So now, let's take a moment. It's 2 a.m. You're wedged between your cousin Beatrice, who has night terrors, and your older brother who sleeps like he's reenacting a sword fight. Your baby is gurgling. A rat is stealing the last of your barley biscuit. The dog has gas. Your feet are cold. You've got lice again. And yet, you sleep. Because what else is there? No TikTok. No podcasts. No bath bombs. Just shared warmth, darkness, and the sound of everyone breathing in chaotic, imperfect harmony. The reality is, for most people, sleep was communal. You shared your bed. You shared your dreams. You shared your fleas. There's even evidence that this closeness fostered intimacy, not in a romantic way, but in the sense of knowing each other. Knowing how someone twitches when they dream, or who talks in their sleep, or who starts every morning with a joke and a song, even if the joke's bad and the song's worse. You weren't alone, not even when you wanted to be. The medieval bed was a place of prayer, punishment, sickness, intimacy, and survival. It was also, often, your deathbed. Most people died at home, in bed, surrounded by family, friends, and maybe the local priest. You'd say your last prayers, kiss your loved ones goodbye, and hope the straw mattress didn't squeak too loudly during your final breath. And when you were gone, someone else would take your spot. The mattress wouldn't be burned. It would be reused, restuffed, reclaimed. Because bedding was expensive and your soul wasn't using it anymore. So you lie there, again, eyes open, breathing the musty, sacred air of 1,000 dreams and 400 years of body odor. Next to people you love, and a few you don't. But all of you, just trying to make it through the night. Next time, we'll look at what the church really thought about sleep and why monks had a bedtime schedule that could be best described as engineered for suffering. You are a monk now. Congratulations. Your name is probably something like Brother Alcuin or Brother Wulfstan or Brother something that sounds like a vowel choking on itself. You have renounced the world. You have said goodbye to women, wine, gossip, music, personal opinion, and anything that might resemble happiness after dusk. And now, you sleep poorly. Because sleep, to the medieval church, was both suspicious and dangerous. Not the act of sleeping itself, per se, After all, even saints need to shut their eyes eventually, but rather the pleasure of it. The ease. The way it lures you away from prayer, discipline, and fear of damnation. And so, your new religious life is about to weaponize sleep against you. Don't worry. It'll be peaceful, quiet, and just uncomfortable enough to keep you clinging to salvation like a cold, scratchy blanket of eternal guilt. You've joined a monastery following the rule of Saint Benedict. This rule, written in the 6th century and still ruining REM cycles 900 years later, dictates nearly every part of your day, including your sleep, which is now less about rest and more about moral struggle. Let's begin with the setting. Your cell, if we're being generous with language, is more of a shared dormitory, especially in the early Middle Ages. Individual cells come later, when monasteries get wealthier or when too many monks start sleep-punching each other in the dark. The bed? Minimalist. A wooden frame, a thin sack of straw, and a single blanket. No pillows. Because luxury is sin-adjacent. You do not get a pillow unless you are the abbot, the pope, or very, very lucky. Even then, the pillow might be filled with repentance. Or goat hair. You go to bed early, very early, right after Compline, the final prayer service of the evening. That's around sunset, or shortly thereafter. So let's say, 7 p.m. in winter, maybe 8:30 in summer if the sun is being a drama queen. You go to bed with your clothes on. Yes, full habit. Tunic, belt, probably your shoes, unless your monastery has some radical anti-footwear leanings. The idea is to always be ready to leap from bed and into prayer, or death if necessary. Because your sleep is about to be interrupted. Again, and again, and again. The night is broken up by scheduled prayer sessions, including the famously cruel nocturnes and matins. These begin around 2 a.m. Sometimes earlier. Sometimes much earlier. You are expected to wake with zeal, leap from bed, and join your brothers in chanting psalms in a pitch-dark chapel that smells like cold wax, damp stone, and whatever emotions a goose leaves behind when it dies in fear. Imagine this. You've just started dreaming about a warm fire and your mother's barley stew. Then someone rings a bell the size of a donkey, and suddenly 40 hooded men are shuffling down stone halls in silence, like penitential penguins in search of divine forgiveness. Once in the chapel, you chant. Sometimes for 20 minutes. Sometimes for 3 hours. Depending on the monastery, the feast day, the mood of the abbot, or whether someone important died 47 years ago today. You chant in Latin, of course, because God only listens to Latin in this period. Or, more accurately, because Latin is the language of scripture and tradition and also makes everything feel about 30% holier and 70% more confusing. And then, back to bed. Unless it's close enough to dawn to just stay awake. In which case, congrats. You've just been spiritually robbed of second sleep. Now, let's talk about why the church did this. Because monks weren't just trying to be tired. They were trying to be holy. They believed in vigilance, spiritual and physical. Staying awake was an act of devotion, an echo of Christ's suffering in the Garden of Gethsemane, when his disciples couldn't stay awake to pray. And if they couldn't do it, you sure as heaven better try harder. To sleep too deeply was to risk sin. Dreams could be gateways to temptation. The devil often worked the night shift, whispering unspeakable ideas into your slumbering brain. Impure dreams? Clearly a sign of weak faith. Wet dreams? Even worse. The monastic solution? Suppress the body. Mortify the flesh. Make sleep a battleground. There are records of monks sleeping on hard floors, on wooden boards, or in awkward postures to avoid feeling too comfortable. Some even slept sitting up, arms crossed over their chest like a medieval Dracula. Did it help? Well, spiritually, maybe. Medically? Absolutely not. But sleep apnea hadn't been invented yet, and no one had written a best-selling book about circadian rhythms, so they were just winging it on holy instinct and chronic fatigue. And yet, paradoxically, monks were also supposed to sleep enough to serve God well. The rule of Saint Benedict allows for 6 to 8 hours, is spread out correctly, interrupted by prayer and penance. So yes, you can sleep, just not like a normal human being. You sleep like a spiritual alarm clock. One that resets every 3 hours and occasionally cries in Latin. Of course, this sleep-deprived holiness wasn't just for monks. Nuns followed similar patterns, though often with stricter rules about bodily contact and talking. Some orders even punished sisters who overslept by making them pray barefoot in the snow. Because nothing says divine compassion like hypothermia. Certain saints took the war on sleep even further. There's St. Catherine of Siena, famously intense, who allegedly slept 2 hours a night and considered yawning a personal failure. Or St. Macarius, who claimed to sleep while standing upright, tied to a wall, just in case he accidentally got comfortable and sinned via nap. Or St. Simeon Stylites, who avoided beds entirely by living on top of a pillar for 37 years. Because what better way to escape temptation than by being physically unreachable? These saints became models of radical sleep deprivation, turning exhaustion into a form of prayer. To them, spiritual wakefulness was more important than physical rest. Sleep was seen not as a basic need, but as a test, a moral frontier, an addition for heaven. So, you lie back in your cell, eyes heavy, cold air settling around your ankles, your belly still, humming from the single turnip you had for dinner. Your fingers twitch, sore from holding your candle during matins. You whisper a final prayer to Saint Benedict, or maybe Saint Insomnia, and drift off again, knowing full well the bell will ring soon, and the psalms will start again. And still, you sleep. Lightly, cautiously, prayerfully. Because in the eyes of your monastery, even your dreams belong to God. Up next, we'll be exploring what sleep looked like for people who couldn't afford beds at all. The homeless, the travelers, the outcasts, and the excommunicated. Where did they sleep? What did they dream? And how often were they arrested for doing it? You're awake again. Only this time, you're not in a monastery. You're not on a straw bed. You're not even indoors. You are outside. Because in this chapter, you are one of the people no one wrote bedtime prayers for. You are landless, poor, traveling, exiled, or just plain unlucky. And tonight, like many nights, you are sleeping wherever someone hasn't already told you to leave. There is no bed. There is no roof. There is no Compline. There is only you, a threadbare cloak, a surprisingly aggressive night wind, and the constant hope that someone doesn't come along and steal your boots while you're trying to remember what warmth felt like. Welcome to the homeless reality of medieval sleep. Now, let's back up just a bit. It's easy to romanticize the Middle Ages if you squint. Cloisters, thatched cottages, candlelight. Maybe a troubadour humming something melancholy about a rose and a knight. But the truth is, thousands, tens of thousands of people at any given time, sleeping outdoors wasn't a quirky adventure. It was survival. And it was usually illegal. Cities and towns, especially from the 12th century onward, became increasingly hostile to vagrants, strangers, rogues, and the wonderfully vague category of people who look like they're not supposed to be here. That includes the unemployed, the traveling poor, peddlers, pilgrims, too many nights on the road and people start to get twitchy, actors, performers, and minstrels, excommunicates, and anyone who refused to be conveniently identifiable as either a peasant or a lord. If you didn't belong to a town, didn't work for a guild, or didn't have the right accent, you were suspect. And if you were caught sleeping outdoors, that was grounds for arrest, or beating, or having your meager belongings tossed into the gutter. Because in medieval logic, sleep plus poverty equaled crime. You weren't resting. You were loitering, possibly plotting, almost certainly smelling. So, you had to hide to sleep, in the shadows, in alleyways, beneath market stalls after the vendors had gone. You had to find places with just enough cover to be warm, but not enough visibility to be accused of sinning against the municipal sense of tidiness. Church porches were common, because, ironically, the church preached charity while locking its doors at night. Some monasteries gave shelter to the destitute, sure, but others had strict rules about who could stay and how long they were allowed to breathe in their sacred proximity. And so, you sleep in ruins, stables, abandoned mills, barns, or anywhere with 3 walls and a vaguely intact roof. If you're lucky, a kind soul lets you stay near their fire, or in the shed with the pigs, or in the loft above the cowpen, which is warm, yes, but smells like a damp leather shoe that's been filled with turnips and regret. The ground is your mattress. Dirt, frozen mud, cobblestone. Your blanket is a wool cloak with more holes than fabric. Your pillow is a sack of belongings, assuming you still own a sack. And your company? Rats. dogs, maybe another person, maybe three, maybe more if you've ended up near a city gate where the unwanted tend to pile up like forgotten laundry. You sleep curled, tucked, braced against the cold. You don't stretch. You don't sprawl. You don't dream. You lie still, listening, always listening, because someone might decide they need your cloak more than you do. Or the guard might see you and chase you off with a stick, and the kind of language usually reserved for people who've committed high treason or adultery with livestock. And yet, people did sleep like this. Constantly. Because they had to. Medieval society was deeply stratified. If you weren't part of a household, whether noble, merchant, or monastic, you were unhoused. And while the word homeless didn't exist in the same way back then, the condition absolutely did. You might be a widow who lost her husband and her status, a freed serf who left the manor in search of better work and found nothing, a child abandoned, orphaned, or simply born in the wrong alley, a journeyman out of coin and luck between towns, a disgraced cleric, cast out for believing the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing with the wrong person in the right bishop's garden. These were the bedless sleepers. And they were everywhere. Now, some towns tried to help. Kind of. There were almshouses, primitive shelters run by churches or wealthy benefactors who needed to buy a little salvation on the side. These were often reserved for the deserving poor, meaning the elderly, the sick, the visibly dying, or those with tragic backstories and no political opinions. If you were a young, able-bodied man just trying to find work, get back to the road. You smell like blasphemy and bad news. Then there were the hospitals, which, in medieval times, weren't medical centers so much as spiritual hospices. Some would give you food and a floor to sleep on. Others were overcrowded hellholes full of dying people, rotting straw, and monks who'd rather be asleep. If you were on pilgrimage, you had a slightly better shot. Inns and hostels often made exceptions for pilgrims, especially if you could produce a badge or a reliquary or a convincing limp. But pilgrims, too, ended up sleeping outdoors more often than they wanted to. Travel was slow. Towns were spread out. Hospitality was a dice roll. And many ended their journey snoring in a ditch near Canterbury, cursing St. Thomas and their own deeply questionable life choices. And then there were criminals. Yes, they slept too. Usually in prisons, which were not buildings so much as holes with walls. Dungeons. Towers. Underground vaults where sleep meant curling up beside the corpses of last week's debtors and hoping you didn't get eaten by someone on a no-bread diet. Inmates brought their own bedding, if they had any. Otherwise, they slept on the floor. Or chained to it. Fun fact, some medieval jails charged rent for better sleeping spots. So if you wanted a blanket and a wall to lean on, you had to pay for the privilege of not freezing to death while awaiting execution. Because nothing says justice like a bunk fee. Now, let's say you were neither criminal nor cleric. Just a woman, alone, traveling, or widowed. Good luck. Single women, without male protectors, were viewed as suspicious. Sleeping rough as a woman meant risking not just exposure, but assault, arrest, and every kind of medieval paranoia about witches, seductresses, and women who walk alone at night. So you hide. Behind barns. In trees. Beneath carts. You stay half awake. Always. Because sleep isn't safe. It's not peaceful. It's not sacred. It's a liability. And yet, you sleep. Eventually. You sleep because your body demands it. Because exhaustion is louder than fear. Because the world might be cruel, but your eyelids don't care about social hierarchies. You sleep because even in a ditch, with your back against cold stone and your cloak pulled over your nose, there's something human about closing your eyes and drifting into whatever dream your stomach will allow. In this way, sleep becomes its own kind of prayer, a surrender, a fragile hope that when you wake up, things might be different, that you'll find warmth, or work, or even a real bed. But until then, you breathe the night air, you curl your limbs, you listen for footsteps, and you rest in the only place that will have you. Next time, we'll explore the strangest and most intense bedtime rituals from across medieval Europe. From sleeping in graves to wearing amulets made of powdered saints. You've survived another medieval day. You've dodged the plague, avoided starvation, and only got mildly cursed by that one toothless woman at the market whose onions you questioned. Congratulations. Now, it's finally time for bed. But before you can enjoy your flea-infested straw mat, lumpy feather sack, or your favorite corner of the pig shed, you must perform rituals. Because in the Middle Ages, sleep wasn't just sleep. It was spiritually hazardous downtime. A terrifying little coma you entered every night without any guarantee that your soul would return unscathed, or at all. You could die in your sleep. You could be possessed. You could be visited by demons, saints, or your angry dead uncle asking about that cursed chalice you definitely pawned for soup money. So naturally, people came up with bedtime strategies. Some were sweet. Some were superstitious. Some were so profoundly strange that they'd make modern sleep influencers cry into their organic lavender pillows. Let's get you ready for bed, 13th century style. First, you say your prayers. Obviously. But not just any prayers. You recite very specific, often memorized verses, many of which sound eerily like you're trying to bribe God into babysitting your soul overnight. One popular go-to, the prayer that goes, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Bless the bed that I lie on. Simple, rhyming, protective. Each gospel writer assigned a spiritual corner of your mattress, as though your sleep required a holy security team. Think of it like turning your bed into a celestial Airbnb, and the apostles are on night watch. In Latin, this takes on a much more dramatic flair, because Latin turns everything into a legal document written by someone who hasn't blinked in 4 days. The idea behind these prayers wasn't just reverence, it was insurance. The medieval soul was constantly on the edge of eternal damnation. And sleep? Sleep was like loosening your grip on the ladder to heaven. One wrong dream, and boom, you wake up possessed or you don't wake up at all. Now, once you've said your prayers, it's time to arrange your room, or your space, or your barn nook. And this involves warding off evil. Yes, you must physically defend your sleep area from invisible night demons. Because in medieval folklore, sleep wasn't just a natural process. It was a spiritual vulnerability, a literal window to the soul. And just like real windows in the 1200s, these were often broken, unlatched, and filled with birds. Here are some of the weird and wonderful methods people used. 1. Holy relics in the bed. Nothing says comfort like sleeping next to the calcified thumb of Saint Edmund. That's right. People would tuck bits of holy relics under their pillows or hang them above the bed for protection. Hair of a martyr. Bone fragment of a saint. Scrap of cloth that allegedly touched the Virgin Mary's elbow once. All fair game. The belief was that these relics formed a sort of spiritual shield, like the medieval version of antivirus software, except instead of stopping malware, it was supposed to keep Satan from sitting on your chest at 3 a.m. 2. Sleeping in a cross shape. This one's straightforward but physically awkward. You lie on your back with your arms stretched out, imitating the crucifixion. Supposedly, this made you less appealing to demons, or at least harder to carry off. It's not comfortable. You look like you've been flattened by divine traffic. But hey, no evil spirits tonight, so that's a win. 3. Drawing crosses on the bed. Before lying down, many people would trace crosses on the sheets, the walls, their own foreheads, their livestock. Basically anything within cursing range. Some would draw these with holy water. Others used chalk. A few just did the motion with their fingers and hoped God had decent vision in the dark. 4. Protective charms and amulets. One popular item, a small sack filled with herbs and sacred text scraps. You wear it around your neck or you pin it to your nightgown. Inside might be a tiny parchment with a verse from Psalms, some dried rue or vervain, maybe even a sliver of lead if you're really into confusing poisons with protection. Others wore amulets made of metal, carved with gibberish that looked vaguely holy. Because if demons couldn't read it, they presumably couldn't curse it. Classic logic. And some people, bless them, just slept with a crucifix clutched to their chest like a teddy bear made of guilt and wood. 5. Eating sleep-promoting foods. Of course, no bedtime routine is complete without a snack. For medieval people, the trick was to avoid anything too indulgent before bed. No red meat. No onions. No spicy stews. Spices were known to excite the humors, which is not nearly as funny as it sounds. If you were wealthy, you might have a little warm milk with honey. If you were poor, maybe just dry bread dipped in sadness. But there were sleep aids, lettuce, poppy seeds, and occasionally, if you were really desperate, wine with dissolved opium. Not recommended, but definitely effective. 6. sleeping with one eye open, spiritually. Some people kept candles lit all night. Expensive, sure. But the belief was that light repelled evil. A lit candle might keep demons away, but it also turned your home into a fire hazard surrounded by hay and existential dread. This was less of an issue for monks, who often kept someone on night watch, rotating through the hours to ensure prayers continued and nobody died mid-dream without the appropriate paperwork. 7. Bed positioning. Want a peaceful sleep? Never position your bed with the head facing north. That was the direction associated with death, or magnetic misfortune, or maybe just a general vibe of don't point your skull at the cosmic freezer. South facing? Good. East? Holy. West? Acceptable. North? Congratulations, you've summoned something unpleasant. And of course, if you lived in a house with other people, which you almost certainly did, your sleep was not private. There was no such thing as a master bedroom. There was one room, possibly two, and everyone slept in it, together. Children, parents, servants, pigs, dogs, in-laws, and probably someone named Walter who just refuses to leave. So if you were praying before bed, you were doing it out loud, possibly while your brother farted beside you and your uncle chewed something aggressively in the corner. This was the communal bed prayer experience. Part reverent, part chaotic, entirely medieval. And yet, despite the weirdness, the paranoia, and the total absence of memory foam, there was something comforting about it all. Because bedtime rituals weren't just about fear. They were about control. In a world full of unpredictable threats, sickness, bandits, famine, the occasional Viking, you couldn't stop the bad things from happening. But you could whisper a prayer. You could sprinkle holy water. You could trace a cross and clutch your Sainto amulet and fall asleep knowing you'd done your part. And if you were lucky, you'd wake up, which, in the Middle Ages, was never a guarantee. So, you roll over. Your candle flickers. You hear the wind whispering against the shutters. You murmur your final prayer, and you drift into dreams full of angels, demons, saints, and soup, because you're pretty sure you fell asleep hungry again. Next, we'll step into the world of medieval royalty, where bedtime wasn't about fear, it was about performing power through absurd levels of comfort, noise, and fabric. You wake up, but not in a barn, not in a cold, damp cell, not beneath a cart next to a pig named Jeffrey. You wake up in a chamber so absurdly over-decorated that it looks like someone melted a cathedral and poured it onto a mattress. Because in this chapter, you are royalty. Yes, you. You wear a crown. You eat off golden plates. And your pajamas cost more than most people's houses. Welcome to the bedroom of a medieval king or queen, where going to sleep is less about rest and more about putting on a performance so elaborate it requires multiple people and a deep fear of being seen horizontal in public. Let's pull back the velvet curtains, literally, and see what bedtime looks like when you rule a country but can't pee without a footman's assistance. First things first, your bed is not just a bed. It is a sacred throne of unconsciousness. It is massive, carved from oak, maybe even walnut if you're fancy, gilded with gold leaf, and draped in more fabric than most medieval weddings. We're talking four-poster bed with heavy embroidered curtains, feather mattresses piled so high they require assistance to mount, and cushions so stuffed you're not sure whether to lie on them or conduct a séance. The mattress? Likely a combination of down feathers, wool, and expensive regret. It's warm, softish, full of mites, sure, but they're royal mites, probably with titles and feudal obligations of their own. Above you, a canopy, often called a tester, carved with religious scenes, royal crests, or possibly just the anguished faces of artisans who spent 6 months chiseling it for a man who thought bathing twice a year was extreme. Now, despite being in a massive room, possibly the size of a modern gymnasium, you are not alone, ever. Because sleeping in the Middle Ages wasn't private, and being royal made it worse. You are attended, at night, by people. People who have job titles like groom of the stool, esquire of the body, and chief bed curtain arranger, whose sole purpose is to stand respectfully in the corner while you get into your royal pajamas, which, incidentally, are probably made of fine linen or silk and feature embroidery so delicate it requires its own poem. The bedtime ritual begins with undressing. Not done by you. Don't be ridiculous. You are royalty. You haven't touched your own laces in years. Your attendants remove your outer garments layer by layer, while you stand there thinking about tax reform or which cousin to marry off for grain. Each piece is inspected, folded, catalogued, placed in a cedar-lined chest or handed to a servant who vanishes into the fabric-swollen labyrinth of your closet chamber. Then comes washing. A basin, warm water, a cloth, possibly rose-scented soap if it's the 14th century and you're feeling decadent. Your face, hands, and feet are wiped clean, not by you. Again, please, by a servant who's trained in the delicate art of making sure the king doesn't stub his toe on a nightstand. Once you're prepped, it's time for evening prayers. These may be done with your chaplain or alone, but never really alone. Your chamber is likely still full of rustling attendants and possibly a visiting noble trying to discuss war plans while you're halfway through a psalm and completely over this day. Then finally, you are escorted to bed. Not flopped into bed. Escorted. There is a ceremony. At the French court, for example, the ritual of coucher du roi, putting the king to bed, was a public event. Nobles stood in attendance as the monarch was divested of his royal robe, handed his sleeping cap, and tucked into bed like a very powerful toddler who owns half of Burgundy. And yes, the king slept in a nightcap. Usually white. Usually ridiculous. But warm and adorned with enough embroidery to distract from the fact that it made him look like a sleepy duck. Once in bed, curtains were drawn, by attendants, not by you. These were heavy, ornate, and designed not only to retain warmth but also to symbolically shield you from the mortal world. The bed became a cocoon of holiness, authority, and unspoken night farts. Now, you'd think that once curtains are closed, the room would empty. It does not, because even kings get anxious in the dark. There are guards stationed near the bedchamber, sometimes inside the room. There's a cupbearer, in case you need a drink at 2 a.m. There's likely a doctor on call, especially if you're old, gouty, or suspiciously coughing up blood. And sometimes, just for fun, there's a court jester who sleeps nearby. Not to entertain you at night, but because that's how messed up palace logistics were. You fall asleep to the sound of breathing, whispering, occasionally, prayers. Sometimes, snoring from a footman slumped in a chair nearby, who will be blamed for treason if you wake up cranky. And yes, royal sleep was interrupted often. By nightmares. By messengers. By the haunting knowledge that your second cousin is plotting your assassination. And also by the chamber pot situation, which brings us to the part of royal bedtime that no one likes to discuss. The royal toilet. Located near the bed. Sometimes within arm's reach. Often a padded chair with a removable pan. It was attended to by a specific servant whose literal job, was to assist you with nighttime elimination. And if you think they were spared the ceremony, think again. They kept records. They wrote things down. That's how we know Henry VIII had constipation. Because someone was paid to log it. Now let's not forget, queens slept too. Their routines were similar, with additional layers of modesty, gossip, and pressure to not die in childbirth. Female attendants would help the queen undress, brush her hair, and sometimes sleep nearby in case she had a prophetic dream about fertility, diplomacy, or being smothered by velvet. Royal women often shared their beds, not sexually, but as part of diplomatic bonding. Sharing a bed was intimate. Political. You might wake up next to your best friend, your daughter, or your future betrayer. Cozy. If you're a royal child, you sleep in an adjacent chamber. Raised by nurses and nannies who whisper lullabies about saints and sin, your room might have miniature tapestries and a toy sword. But mostly it smells like candle wax and maternal anxiety. And if you're a sickly king, every night is a referendum on whether you'll wake up tomorrow. Doctors might insist on certain bed alignments. Sleeping upright. Wearing herbs around your neck. Drinking potions that contain ingredients like crushed emerald, powdered deer horn, or something suspiciously labeled black remedy. They didn't know what half of it did, but it kept the court alchemists employed. And so, you sleep. Or try to. You roll over. The bed creaks. Your crown is off. Your breathing is heavy. A servant coughs. And just outside the curtain, history waits, quiet, tense, full of ambition, and very bad breath. Because in royal bedrooms, sleep is never truly restful. It is guarded, interrupted, performed. You dream not in peace, but in state. You wake not when rested, but when required. Because your life doesn't belong to you, it belongs to your kingdom. even in your dreams. Next, we'll enter the world of medieval dreams, their meanings, their dangers, and what happened when your subconscious went rogue in the 12th century. You dream. But you're not dreaming about flying, or turning up to work in your underwear, or showing up late to your high school chemistry exam, even though you're 42. No, you're dreaming medieval style. Which means your subconscious is a battlefield between divine messages, demonic manipulation, and something you ate last Thursday that's still causing psychic turbulence. Welcome to the wild, weird, and deeply unsettling world of medieval dreams, where no vision is random, every nightmare might be an omen, and waking up screaming is considered a normal theological response. To begin, imagine you're asleep in your medieval bed. It could be royal. It could be peasant grade. Either way, you are unconscious. Your soul is floating through the dreamscape, and medieval people believed this was not a private journey. Your soul, temporarily unanchored by sleep, is now open to outside forces. Heavenly ones. Hellish ones. Occasionally prophetic chickens. Let's break this down. Because in the Middle Ages, dreams weren't dreams. They were messages. They meant things. And not in the cute horoscope way. No. In the your cousin might get executed if you dream about a white horse in the rain kind of way. You might be asking, where did this dream obsession come from? Excellent question. Let's blame a few dead philosophers. First, the Greeks. Plato, Aristotle, and their intellectual gangsters all weighed in on dreams. Aristotle said they were just a result of digestion. Plato thought dreams revealed hidden truths. Basically, if you dreamed about flying, Aristotle said it was because you ate too many figs, and Plato said it meant you secretly desired freedom and also might be a pigeon. Next, the Romans. Cicero, Seneca, and others liked to catalog dreams. They loved dissecting them, like supernatural science experiments. Did you dream of a snake? Could be deception. A bear? Danger. A woman dancing? Well, now that depends. Was she upside down? Was she missing any limbs? Was she singing in Latin? Context matters. But it was during the Christianization of Europe that dreams got interesting. Because when you throw the Bible into a dream interpreter's toolkit, things escalate quickly. Suddenly, dreams aren't just symbolic, they're divine communications. God sent messages through dreams. So did angels. And saints. And, if you were unlucky, Satan. You, sleeping peacefully after a long day of field plowing or court scheming, could find yourself visited by a glowing figure in your dream whispering, "Repent. Fast. Stop stealing cheese from the monastery." And you'd wake up sweaty, terrified, and possibly halfway through a pilgrimage before sunrise. So let's look at the types of dreams, according to medieval belief. 1. Visio, the vision. These are prophetic dreams. You're seeing something that will come true. Maybe your village will flood. Maybe a king will die. Maybe your aunt will spontaneously combust during Lent. Either way, your dream is a warning, and you'd better tell someone. Preferably a monk with a quill. 2. Somnium, the enigma. These dreams are symbolic. Like when you dream of climbing a mountain made of cheese while being chased by angry nuns. It's not literal. It's a metaphor. For what? No one knows, but a local dream interpreter will charge you half a chicken to figure it out. 3. Oraculum, the oracle. This is a dream where someone talks to you directly. A saint. A ghost. An angel. Sometimes your dead grandmother. It's not subtle. They just appear and say, "Build a church. Here. Now." And you do it because you're terrified. 4. Insomnium, the nonsense. These are the dreams that are meaningless. Caused by indigestion, wine, stress, or sleeping too close to a goat. No divine message. Just weird images and confusion. Still, people often misinterpreted these as prophetic and accidentally started wars. And finally, the terrifying one. 5. Phantasma, the demon dream. This is where demons creep into your sleep. You experience sleep paralysis. You feel a presence pressing down on your chest, maybe whispering dark things into your ear, and you can't wake up. Sound familiar? Modern science calls this sleep paralysis. The Middle Ages called it incubus or night hag. Because naturally, if something terrifying happens in the night, you assume a supernatural birdwoman with hooves is involved. That's just logic. People wrote entire treatises on how to defend against demonic dreams. Things like, sleeping with a crucifix under your pillow, praying the Psalms before bed, especially Psalm 91, the medieval sleep number, not sleeping on your back, evidently the devil prefers to perch on your chest, not eating too much meat before bed, sorry, Geoffrey the pig. But dream protection wasn't just for peasants. Monks, kings, and scholars all took dreams deadly seriously. Saint Benedict was said to receive messages from God in dreams. Saint Perpetua, in her prison cell awaiting execution, dreamed of climbing a golden ladder to heaven while fighting off a dragon. Not a metaphor, just Tuesday. In contrast, Emperor Constantine allegedly dreamed of a cross before his battle at the Milvian Bridge. A glowing sign in the sky said, "In this sign, conquer." So he did. That dream literally changed the course of Western history. Meanwhile, the average medieval person dreamed of fields, animals, saints, or dying in increasingly metaphorical ways, and woke up convinced their cow was about to drop dead or their neighbor was definitely a witch. And guess what? There were dream interpreters. Traveling ones. Local ones. Some were monks. Some were mystics. Some were just really confident liars with books. They take your dream and say something like, "Oh, you dreamed of a black dog eating a loaf of bread? That means your harvest will fail unless you donate to the church immediately. And also maybe you're cursed. That'll be 3 eggs and a coin." Books like the Somnial Danielis, a wildly popular medieval dream dictionary, offered definitions for thousands of dream symbols. Dream of a dragon? Power, but also potential doom. Dream of a ladder? A journey of spiritual enlightenment. Unless it breaks. Then, sorry. Dream of fish? Depends. Are they cooked? Are they talking to you? Are they judging your sins? All critical factors. But don't think only men got prophetic dreams. Women, especially holy women, were believed to have special access to divine visions during sleep. Nuns wrote dream journals. Some had dream reputations where everyone knew Sister Margaret had the good stuff. If she dreamed about fire, you'd better douse your roof. On the other hand, if your dreams seemed demonic and you were a woman, well, enjoy your impromptu heresy trial. Now let's get specific. Here are a few real medieval dreams recorded by actual people. A monk dreams that Satan comes into the abbey disguised as a bear, eats all the bread, and then explodes. A woman dreams of being chased by a talking chicken wearing a crown. She takes this as a warning about pride. A peasant dreams of Saint Michael scolding him for peeing near a shrine. The next day, he finds a coin in the dirt and donates it immediately. A French noble dreams of burning in hell for gluttony. He fasts for 3 weeks, then dies of unrelated goat injuries. Bottom line, medieval people didn't joke about dreams. They prayed about them, documented them, and sometimes based real-world decisions on them. You wake up from a dream of a serpent eating your toes? You don't just shrug and make oatmeal. You go to the priest. You light a candle. You check on your cousin. You avoid rivers for at least a week. Because what happens in dreams doesn't stay in dreams. It follows you. Into daylight. Into sermons. Into suspicious glances from your neighbors. And sometimes into trial records. So now, as you drift off into your own dream world, filled with half-remembered medieval facts, gentle sarcasm, and the lingering smell of barley, you begin to wonder, is this just sleek? Or is Saint Benedict about to yell at you in Latin again? Either way, you close your eyes and hope it's just a cheese. You wake up. Again. It's not morning. It's not even close to morning. It's dark. Still. Cold. Still. The fire has gone out. The coals are little glowing skeletons of warmth. And somewhere outside, a dog is barking at nothing, or maybe at something deeply supernatural. Either way, you're awake. And you're not alone. Because here's a fun, under-discussed fact. Medieval people didn't sleep in one long, blissful stretch. They didn't. You weren't supposed to. The 8-hour uninterrupted sleep that modern people dream about, pun intended, was not how humans used to sleep for most of history. Instead, you did something called segmented sleep or biphasic sleep, because medieval life just loved unnecessary complications. Here's how it worked. You'd go to bed shortly after sunset, because there was no Netflix, no electricity, and no serotonin left to keep you upright, and you'd sleep for a few hours. That's your first sleep. Then, like clockwork, you'd wake up sometime around midnight. Wide awake. No alarm, no rooster, just your brain deciding it had had enough of that dream about St. George wrestling an eel. This period of wakefulness, usually about 1 to 2 hours, was totally normal. So normal, in fact, that people had a name for it. They called it the watch or the waking. It wasn't seen as a problem. It was expected. It was baked into the structure of the night, just like prayers, candles, and low-key dread. So what did people do during this medieval midnight intermission? Oh, all sorts of things. Some prayed. Quietly, in bed or aloud with a candle. Some got up, stirred the fire, maybe added a log, maybe stared into it like they were in a black-and-white Arthur's film about existential despair. Some people even got out of bed. Not in a jog-around-the-block sort of way. This is the Middle Ages, not a gym commercial, but to check on livestock, pee outside, drink some ale, or visit a neighbor. Yes, visiting your neighbor at 1 a.m. was socially acceptable. In fact, this time was considered ideal for conversation. It was quiet, private, dreamy, like a 3 a.m. text, but with more mud. Others, brace yourself, had sex. Medical texts of the time even recommended this hour as optimal. Why? Because your body was well rested but your mind was still soft and malleable. Also, you were less likely to be interrupted by your in-laws. But the most fascinating part of this split sleep pattern was that it was actually seen as good for your soul. Many religious texts, including monastic schedules, included prayers specifically for the middle of the night. Monks woke up deliberately for vigils, chanting psalms in the dark while rubbing their hands together and wondering why the Lord hadn't invented central heating yet. For lay people, this waking time was considered spiritually potent. A thin space. A liminal hour. The veil between worlds was thought to be thinner. Which, frankly, sounds terrifying. But also useful if you're expecting divine visions or at least an explanation for why your cow keeps looking at you like that. And after your wakeful break, you went back to sleep. That was your second sleep, usually lasting until dawn or shortly after. This sleep was often dream-heavy, sometimes described as deeper, more restful, or, according to one 13th century herbal, the sleep of truth. Which sounds majestic until you realize it probably meant you drooled and snored louder. So to summarize, medieval people didn't think broken sleep was broken. They thought it was normal, even ideal. The waking time was practical, social, sacred, even romantic. Compare that to now, where waking up at 2 a.m. leads to anxiety spirals, doom scrolling, and questioning every life choice you've ever made. Medieval you? You'd wake up, throw a shawl over your shoulders, recite a psalm, have a sip of ale, maybe chat with your spouse about what that dream meant, stoke the fire, and then roll over into phase 2 of your nightly nap marathon. Let's not forget, most medieval homes had no real insulation. So this middle night moment wasn't just spiritual, it was functional. You had to maintain the fire. You had to make sure no one had stolen your chickens, or your child, or your firewood. It was a full-time job just staying asleep without freezing, catching plague, or getting robbed. And if you lived in a city, good luck. Night watchmen patrolled the streets, shouting the hour and weather like loud medieval Siri. Drunks stumbled home. Thieves lurked in alleys. Cats had deeply dramatic fights. And someone, somewhere, was playing a recorder badly. So, even if you wanted to sleep through the night, the Middle Ages wouldn't let you. The infrastructure wasn't there. The silence wasn't there. The bedbugs were very much there. And remember, you didn't have a mattress like we do now. You had straw, feathers, or a bag of hay. If you were lucky, you added furs. If you were wealthy, maybe a woolen topper. But mostly, it was lumps and discomfort and maybe a live beetle or two. Sheets? If you could afford them, they were linen. If not, it was just you and the itchy wool blanket of your ancestors. Pillows? Sure, if you were rich. Otherwise, it was a sack of something vaguely soft and suspiciously warm. Temperature control? Forget it. Your room went from Arctic monastery to sauna staffed by ghosts depending on the season. Lighting? If you had a candle, great. If not, you hoped the moon was in a good mood. And yet, somehow, people managed to find a rhythm. A flow. They slept, they woke, they prayed, they talked, they stoked the fire, they peed in a pot, and then they slept again. So what changed? Why don't we sleep like that anymore? Blame the usual suspects. Industrialization, artificial lighting, work schedules, capitalism, and Thomas Edison's smug little face. When people began working factory jobs, they needed consistent sleep schedules. When street lights and electric bulbs became common, it became easier to push bedtime later. Eventually, the cultural expectation became, sleep 8 hours, don't wake up, don't talk to anyone, and if you can't do that, there's something wrong with you. But guess what? There's not. You waking up at 3 a.m. for no reason? That's not insomnia. That's your ancestral bedtime routine calling you back. It wants you to light a candle, mutter about demons, maybe chat about the weather, and then sleep again until the rooster has something to say about it. In fact, studies have shown that biphasic sleep may be more natural for human bodies. Some people function better with 2 shorter sleeps rather than 1 long one. And hey, if it was good enough for monks, peasants, queens, and wandering friars, it might be good enough for you. So tonight, if you wake up in the middle of the night, don't panic. Just remember, this is your first waking. Pray, think, stretch, stare at the ceiling, compose a poem about Geoffrey the pig. And when you're ready, crawl back into your medieval slumber and enjoy your second sleep, the one with the weird prophetic dreams, haunted chickens, and deeply symbolic eels. Sleep tight. And if you hear hooves on your chest, it's probably just the night hag again.